All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started, and some people will probably trickle in here as we get going. Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Jasper Bors, and I'm the Speakers Director of the Buckley Program. I'm joined by Matisse Baton, who's a fellow member of our student board. Before I introduce our guests, I want to say a few words about the Buckley Program. For those of you who don't know, the William F. Buckley Jr. Program is an organization dedicated. Could you guys just mute your mics? I think there's a little bit of feedback. For those of you who don't know, the William F. Buckley Jr. Program is an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We host lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference. Our over 300 Buckley Fellows have a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley Program forwards its mission of a more open and more representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives, including those on the right, must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website, buckleyprogram.com. Now on to our guests today. Professor Michael Lind is a professor of practice at the LBJ School at the University of Texas, a graduate of the Plan II Liberal Arts Honors Program and the Law School at UT with a master's degree in international relations from Yale. Lind has previously taught at Harvard and Johns Hopkins. He's been assistant to the director of the Center for the Study of Foreign Affairs at the US State Department and has been an editor or staff writer for The New Yorker, Harper's, The New Republic, and The National Interest. A co-founder of New America, along with Walter Mead, Cheryl Swenninger, and Ted Halstead, Lind co-founded New America's American Strategy Program and served as policy director of its economic growth program. He's a former member of the boards of Fair Vote and Economists for Peace and Security. Lind has published in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The International Economy, and the Financial Times. He is the author of more than a dozen books of nonfiction, fiction, poetry, and children's literature, including several that were New York Times notable books of the year. His studies of US history, economics, and foreign policy include The Next American Nation, The American Way of Strategy, Land of Promise, An Economic History of the United States, and his latest book, The New Class War, Saving Democracy from the Managerial Elite, which is available for purchase on Amazon.
Dalibor Rohac is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies European political and economic trends. Specifically, he's working on Central and Eastern Europe, the European Union and the Eurozone, US-EU relations, and the post-communist transitions and backsliding of countries of the former Soviet bloc. He's concurrently a visiting junior fellow at the Max Beloff Center for the Study of Liberty at the University of Buckingham in the UK, and a fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs in London. Before joining AEI, Rohac was affiliated with the Cato Institute's Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity, the London-based Legatum Institute, and the Center for the New Europe in Brussels. He has also worked in the office of the President of the Czech Republic in Prague. Rohac's analyses and commentary has been published widely in the media, including in the Financial Times, Los Angeles Times, and the Wall Street Journal Europe. His scholarly articles have been featured in professional journals, among them Constitutional Political Economy, Economic Affairs, and the European Journal for the History of Economic Thought. He has a PhD in Political Economy from King's College London, an MPhil in Economics from St. Anthony's College, Oxford, an MA in Economics from George Mason University, and a BA in Economics from Charles University in Prague. His new book, In Defense of Globalism, is also available for purchase on Amazon.
We are thrilled to welcome Professor Lind and Dr. Rohac this afternoon for a debate on globalism and the future of the American nation. Before I give a brief overview of the format of the debate today, I just want to say a few words about our sponsor, the American Enterprise Institute's Executive Council Program, who's been generous enough to sponsor this debate today. They do excellent activities to promote the scholarship of AEI fellows on college campuses across the United States. And if you'd like to learn more, you can email me at jasper.bors@yale.edu. So I'll give a brief overview of the debate, and then we'll go into our opening statements. So we'll have 5 minutes for opening statements from each guest, starting with Professor Lind and then moving on to Dr. Rohac, and then 2 minutes each for response to each other's opening statements. and then we'll go into questions from Matisse and I and the audience, and we'll give then 2 minutes to conclude to each guest. And to the audience, you all are welcome to submit questions throughout the event, and then we will take those and give them to our guests in the audience Q&A portion. So please join me in warmly welcoming Michael Lind and Dalibor Rohac. Professor Lind, the floor is yours. You're muted. Sorry, Professor Lind.
President Woodrow Wilson had 14 points. I will be succinct this afternoon and limit mine to 6. And my first point has to do with the definition of globalization. We are talking about global politics or a global society. My point 1 is the fact that there is no global government, and that is a good thing. It allows us to have sovereign states rather than a single system. And if there were a world government, it would be established only by some kind of tyrannical empire or hegemon that had suppressed the independence of other societies. So point 1 is there is no world government. From that, we move to point 2. In the absence of a world government, states, and for the purposes of this discussion, I will be talking about great powers, not small states that are dependent on more powerful countries, but on great powers like the United States. In the absence of a world government, states are responsible for their own self-defense. It is a system of self-help. If you are attacked, if you are intimidated, you cannot call the police of the world government because, as we saw in point 1, there is no world government. Well, from this follows point 3. National self-defense depends on national industrial capacity and national solidarity. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, national industrial capacity in the modern world is the basis for military power, even if you're being purely defensive. Without having all kinds of modern industries, from steel to automotives to electronics, you would be dependent on other countries, which could have your supplies either cut off in times of war or crisis, or they could switch alliances. So there has to be a minimum of self-reliance in industrial production on the part of sovereign states, at least, as I say, if they're autonomous great powers. National solidarity, that simply means you cannot allow divisions and inequalities among groups in society, whether they are social classes, whether they are regional cultures or races or ethnicities, from tearing your society apart. Obviously, there's no point in defending a country if it's embroiled in civil war, or if your enemies can manipulate divisions within the society to undermine your country. That brings us to point 4. Globalization can be great. It can be good. Globalization is beneficial when it helps build up and reinforce the strategic industrial capacity of a particular country. And it's good when it increases economic equality and political solidarity among different classes and regions and races. So if export-led growth leads to increased development of formerly backward rural regions, that's a good thing. If it leads to well-paid middle class, that's a good thing. So globalization can be good. Globalization can be bad. That's point 5. When is globalization bad? Well, it's bad when it undermines the 2 points I made earlier, when it undermines your national strategic industrial base, used both for the military and for civilian industries. And it's bad when it undermines the social contract and the relations among different groups in your societies. So we can provide examples later, but for example, when you offshore production of medical and protective equipment to China, a strategic military competitor, and you're then dependent on it during a crisis like the present global COVID-19 epidemic, that's bad globalization. When you allow China, a strategic competitor that is pointing nuclear weapons at the US, that constantly is hacking and testing US cyber defenses, when you allow that country, or any country like that, to subsidize imports that wipe out much of your manufacturing capability, lowering the wages and incomes of much of your population and promoting poverty and destitution and opioid drug addiction, that's bad globalization. So globalization can be good or bad for a particular country, depending on particular circumstances. And that leads me to conclude with my point 6. The American nation state, like any nation state, should follow its national interest. It should engage only in limited and selective globalization, by which I mean limited and selective trade, limited and selective immigration, and limited and selective regulation of financial flows to prevent globalization from undermining its national security and its national solidarity, at the same time while enjoying the benefits of good globalization. And with that, I've had my 6 points, and I will yield the remainder of my time to my opponent.
Thank you, Professor Lind. Dr. Rohac, 5 minutes.
Well, first of all, thank you, Jasper. Thank you, Mathis, for putting this together. I'm delighted to be part of the Buckley program, although it would have been much better if I had been with you in person in New Haven, I suppose. And I'm also delighted to be on the panel with Michael Lind, who really is one of the most significant American intellectuals of our time, whose enormously broad scholarly career I have long followed, ranging from military history and strategy to economic history, all the way to domestic policy. And as an aside, I should say that as I was procrastinating, trying to prepare for this event, I was going to buy my 12-month-old son a copy of Blue Bonnet Girl, only to find out that it sells for $128 on Amazon. So you know, to a globalist neoliberal shill like myself, this is a proof that Michael Lind's work passes the market test. On a more serious note, obviously, Michael has been one of the most intellectually serious critics of what one can call neoliberalism or globalism, of particular features of the post-1990 global order. There are many more of such critics, particularly on the political right. We've seen a mushrooming of such criticisms, particularly after the 2016 election. And I have sympathy for some of the critiques that have been directed at, the rules-based international order, if you will, or at globalization. But many of those criticisms have also felt a little out of sync with my lived experience. Our friends on the political left are big on lived experience, so I'll talk a little bit about my own lived experience. I was 6 years old when communism collapsed in Eastern Europe, and since then, in many of the countries of the region, real incomes almost tripled over essentially a generation, and they tripled particularly in countries that embraced pro-market neoliberal reforms, that rushed to join NATO and the European Union. We are really talking about 100 million people who are now enjoying opportunities that were unthinkable to not that long ago. In constant dollars, in PPP terms, Ukraine and Poland were virtually indistinguishable in 1990. Poland's income per capita has since tripled. Poland obviously embraced fairly drastic pro-market reforms in the 1990s, rushed to join NATO and the European Union. Ukraine never did that. Ukraine's income per capita in PPP terms is below its 1990 level. And to my mind, Eastern Europe and what happened after the fall of communism is illustrative of really what is the biggest strength of this globalized world order underwritten by America-led alliances. After the Second World War, there has been a proliferation of various alliances, international organizations, and rules, which obviously evolved over time. And I would argue that those by and large delivered on their promises. So world population after 1950 roughly tripled. Over the same time, the output of the global economy increased by more than a factor of 10. It is possible that by the end of this decade, extreme poverty will disappear from the surface of the earth. The world has become safer. Incidence of wars and battle-related deaths has been on the decline. In spite of the democratic backsliding in places like Hungary and Poland and the Philippines and Turkey and elsewhere, democracy has actually spread around the world in the post-war era, and the number of democracies systematically exceeds, since 2001, the number of countries ruled by autocrats. Now, I would argue that these beneficial outcomes are not separable from what really has been a shift in the way the global arena has been governed after the Second World War. And from the side of the United States, this has not been an act of charity. It was an act of enlightened self-interest. The United States had previously been dragged into 2 world wars in the 20th century. Many American troops died liberating Europe. And obviously, the US commitment to reshape the world after 1945 went hand in hand with the rise of the US as the global hegemon, went hand in hand with the US ability to shape world affairs to its own advantage. Is the system perfect? Of course not. Are various institutions that now date, in some cases, 70 years or more, in need of an update? Of course. Has US domestic policies been perfect in delivering, particularly for the working classes and the poor? No. But I think a fair look at the facts simply belies the notion of an American carnage and a world that's been taking advantage of America, as some politicians like to suggest. And I don't think the facts warrant America's retreat from the world as advocated by some, not necessarily by Michael, obviously.
Okay, Professor Lind, you have a few minutes to respond to Dr. Rohac's.
Yes, we're in agreement about Europe, including Eastern Europe. I should say I was one of the few people who voted for Ronald Reagan on the Yale campus in 1984. So my anti-communist, anti-Soviet credentials are quite strong. If the world consisted of the EU and NATO and the US and Canada, then we wouldn't be having a debate, because you have more or less balanced trade across the Atlantic. The Germans sell cars in the US and make them. The US sells cars and trucks in the EU. The wage differentials, there are some, including differences between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, which are a source of tension, but they're not enormous. So the project of having kind of a pooled economy where you could exploit increasing returns to scale in things like automobiles and aerospace and so on, and not discriminate on the basis of rules of origin. Within the transatlantic world, I think this has been a success. I think the problem with the post-1990s neoliberal system was there was a premature attempt to transfer this successful, albeit geographically limited, kind of transatlantic common market, Atlantic free trade zone and alliance system, to 2 kinds of countries. One were potentially hostile or hostile great powers, like China and Russia, where, unlike our European trading partners, they were not, part of a common NATO alliance, and they could use technology and trade against us, sometimes for legitimate national interest reasons. They have their own national interests, but that was quite different from the post-war transatlantic system. The other was bringing in countries with extremely low levels of wages and often very poor governance, like Mexico, into this kind of transatlantic zone. So NAFTA would have been completely different if it had been the US and Canada rather than the US and Mexico. And NAFTA really has led to the deindustrialization of much of the Midwest. I checked recently, about 40% of all automobile manufacturing in the United States is now in Mexico. And it is solely because of cheap labor. It's not because Mexican automobile workers are more skillful than American, or for that matter, Canadian automobile workers. So I think if there's a theme to my remarks, it's that two words should guide us in thinking about the interaction of the US with globalization. And those two words are, it depends. It depends on who your trading partners are, and it depends on the circumstances in a particular time.
Professor Rohac, a few minutes to respond.
Not a professor yet, but first of all, I'd like to certainly offer a point of agreement, namely that China does represent a challenge to the United States, to Western alliances, and I think there is a reasonable debate to be had about dependence on China, particularly in strategic sectors. But I'd probably be more cautious in evaluating the effect of that post-1990 globalized era on U.S. domestic workers, manufacturing, etc. So, first of all, when you look at U.S. median income between 1990 and 2016, again, this is not a picture of American carnage. You had a 44% rise in post-tax, post-transfer income for median households. You have 66% increase in median in income for the bottom 20 of the income distribution. You have a 33% increase in wages for so-called typical workers, so workers who are not managers or supervisors over that same period. Could the U.S. economy do better? Of course, but I look at the whole spectrum of sort of domestic policies, and I'm not an expert on U.S. social safety nets and social mobility. Obviously, there are problems that need to be addressed. But arguably, trade is a relatively small part of those factors that have disrupted the operation of labor markets. Employment in manufacturing has trended downwards since the 1970s, although it has risen a little over the past decade. I think has been shown quite convincingly that the majority of those jobs have disappeared because of technology, not because of trade. Also with China, yes, I'm in favor of having a conversation about what can be done to make us more resilient to Chinese influence, including Chinese use of economic tools to gain leverage over the West. But at the same time, a decoupling would bring significant economic downsides. I mean, those years of trade and economic integration with China has brought significant consumer benefits. They have generated significant competitive effects on U.S. companies and have reverberated through the U.S. economy in a way that actually makes every dollar spent on Chinese imports translate into 56 cents that accrue to other U.S. businesses, according to the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco study. So I'll probably stop here, and maybe we can go back and forth or take questions.
Yes, we'll now move on to a couple of moderated questions right before we start the kind of audience Q&A. First of all, I'd like to start with a previous book of Professor Lind, actually. So in The New Class War, Professor Lind describes the rising conflict between the college-credentialed, university-educated managerial class, which, in his account, dominates Western democracies on both sides of the Atlantic, and the kind of high school-educated working class of all races and national origins, which represents about 2/3 of the population. Professor Lind, I wonder if you could walk us through the way in which this kind of new class war is related to the globalization versus nationalism debate. And thereafter, Dr. Rohac, perhaps you could tell us what you think about Professor Lind's framing of this particular question.
Well, thank you. And let me begin by saying that the problem with using abstract national statistics of whether people are better off on average or median is that in a country as large as the United States, you can have suffering regions which are bigger than most European countries. We have 320 million people. So when much of Appalachia and the South get wiped out by trade as well as automation, this is a crisis for national solidarity, even if people in the rest of the country benefit from lower consumer prices. So the term American carnage was Donald Trump. It's not mine, but it is the case that NAFTA did lead to very rapid deindustrialization of the textile producing areas of the American South and great social distress. And the post-2003 China shock led to very rapid and sudden deindustrialization of large parts of the Midwest. Now, why does this matter? It matters because if you read Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, he says that changes when you lift protectionism, the changes should be only slowly and gradually to protect businesses from being wiped out overnight and to protect their workers. So the kind of shock therapy that we saw in Eastern Europe and Russia after the Cold War was disapproved of by Adam Smith himself for purely social rather than economic reasons. And if you look at the election of Donald Trump, at the Brexit vote in Britain, there's a high degree of correlation between rapid deindustrialization and these populist protest votes. And the same is true if you look at France and Germany. The areas that tend to have the most radical populists were the ones, for example, in Eastern Germany, that got wiped out after German unification. So that's not an argument against trade in general, but that's why I said globalization has to include a sense of national solidarity, which includes interregional solidarity.
Well, I certainly wouldn't make the case against interregional solidarity. And I, unlike perhaps some people on the conservative free market right, don't necessarily see market and the government as antagonists. I do think that a vibrant, dynamic, open market economy does need a robust social safety nets and infrastructure and all sorts of public goods provided by the government. So my argument is not one of market fundamentalism. Still, it's worth, I think, keeping track of the magnitude of things that we are discussing here. So let's talk about the China shock, for example. My colleague Mike Strain likes to point out that the sort of upper end of the estimates of the jobs destroyed by increased trade integration with China after 2001 is probably somewhere around 2.4 million. In comparison, every month in the US economy, every month you have around 5 million jobs that are sort of destroyed, like 5 million people are separated from their jobs, and 5 million people find employment. And so, the difference between the two are the net numbers that get reported. So when you think about those 2.4 million people, spread over a decade, is the concern for public policy? Of course, but has it been a big mover even on the regional scale in labor markets? I'm not entirely sure. I think one thing we should not downplay is the importance of the financial shock of 2008. So there is ample evidence that in recessions that were triggered by financial shocks, you do have an increase in support for various sorts of populism and nativism. And I wonder whether that is an important part of the conversation. And you already see, in a way, in Europe, when you look at the share of populist votes going to populist parties, you see a certain plateau that was reached. I don't think Donald Trump is headed for an electoral victory, and he'll probably be defeated by the most centrist and boring and uninspiring of candidates that we can imagine. So if I were to sort of comment on this broad the framing of a sort of realignment going through Western politics, I'm less certain that this is what's going on than I was perhaps 4 or 5 years ago. Maybe we are just going through a temporary phase, and after Trump, maybe politics will look much like it looked before Trump.
Well, can I just add a point to that? Not about Trump, but about automation. We hear this story that this was mostly automation. Well, it's hard to explain how automation rapidly jumped in the United States, in the Midwest, and elsewhere after China entered the World Trade Organization after 2003, when you had this massive fall of manufacturing jobs. And at the same time, if automation were really the reason, how can one explain that Germany, Japan, South Korea, and Sweden have vastly higher robot density, that is robot density per worker? So I just want to raise some doubt about the automation theory. It's true to a certain extent in some manufacturing industries, but this idea that there really wasn't a problem with imports. And you have all of these flourishing cities in the Midwest and the Upper South where you just have a few well-paid people with these highly automated factories. This is not the case. The US is lagging behind other industrial countries when it comes to automation. And you obviously have the manufacturing robots where you have the manufacturing. You have more and more robots in China. The fact is US manufacturing corporations, for reasons that had nothing to do with the free market, it was pure labor arbitrage and desire for subsidies, shut down many factories in the US to open them, some in Mexico, but many of them in South China, where they had an unfree, repressed, low-wage workforce. They had government subsidies of land, electricity, everything they wanted. If they wanted a new supply chain built, the Chinese dictatorship would build it for them. So this was not the free market at work. And in fact, I would argue that the distribution of supply chains and factories in the world since the 1990s has had almost nothing to do with the free market. It's had almost nothing to do with the theory of Ricardian comparative advantage. It's almost entirely internal strategic decision-making by a small number of multinational corporations, many of them based in the US. Most studies show that between 1/3 and 1/2 of so-called international trade is actually not only inter-industry trade, it's intra-firm trade, right? It's Apple, moving things around from Shenzhen in China, suppliers in Italy and elsewhere. And those decisions are largely dominated not by market forces, they're driven by labor arbitrage, pitting groups of workers with different wages against each other, tax arbitrage, trying to play games with taxes. For example, Apple hiding many of its profits in Ireland in kind of non-existent employees, and regulatory arbitrage, going wherever the regulations are least. So to me, it's an interesting experiment. What if these multinationals had not gamed the different labor forces and rules of different countries? What would globalization look like under a free market? We have no idea, because present day globalization is the result of corporate decision-making. It's not the result of a free market.
Dr. Rohac, if you'd like to respond, the floor is yours. I'd also like to know to let the audience know that they can start submitting questions for the Q&A section.
Sure. So I definitely agree that we are not living in a free market utopia, and that the post-1990 world was not anywhere near that sort of idealized benchmark. So I'm not even feeling the urge to sort of try to compare the real world outcomes relative to that benchmark. But one sort of point of observation that might be interesting is that we've seen like in the United States, in particular, a rise in sort of national level concentration, as can be measured by, for example, rising markups in manufacturing, and those tend to be associated with with rising productivity, not rising prices. We haven't seen prices of many of the manufactured goods go up very much over the past 20 years. So that suggests to me that there have been actually increases in productivity, real gains that accrued to US consumers and US businesses. The idea that this was just a sort of clever manipulation of the market in a sort of zero-sum environment, to me is not terribly compelling. But again, like, we might easily sort of move this discussion into a very sort of technical direction, and it's been a while since I've done sort of proper economics, so I'll stop here.
My question is primarily for Professor Lind, but Dr. Rohac, please feel free to jump in. So you just said that a lot of the recent economic globalization, at least since the 1990s, has been helmed by these large multinational corporations, which have assumed kind of this position of political leadership, at least within the United States. So my question is, if we are to retreat somewhat from the globalized paradigm, does that move have to be led in part by these corporations who are responsible for it in the first place? So I guess my example that I'm thinking of is post-war Japan, and it's automotive companies who very much had in mind the idea of the national interest in terms of their strategic orientation with regard to the rest of their competition in the United States.
That's an excellent question. I actually agree with the libertarian economist Milton Friedman, with whom I had a nice lunch one time at Stanford University. It is not the business of corporations to worry about the national interest. It's the business of the government. I don't believe in a corporate state with benevolent paternalistic corporations. They exist to make money for their shareholders and for their managers. So I want to have the US government set up a system and say, okay, this is what you're going to do. You're going to be limited for national security to this. There are certain rules for investment, for dealing with labor. I think we need some kind of system of organized labor, mainly as an alternative to trying to get Congress to micromanage details. Let organized labor, organized business work it out. It's more flexible. But be that as it may, you just set up the rules, set up the system, and then let the companies, do what they want, and that's what they do best. Industrial capitalism is the greatest engine of wealth creation in human history. There's nothing like it. And the corporation, which many people despise, and it does have problems, but it is the greatest device for concentrating large-scale capital that is capable of being mobilized for research and development and product development without having a government bureaucracy do it. So I'm all in favor of industrial capitalism and corporations. I just think the responsibility to protect the national interest falls on the elected representatives of the nation state itself.
If I can offer just a quick observation that struck me during this conversation, and while I was reading some of Michael's work in the prior week, I get the sense that like what Michael is talking about is a sort of very sort of sophisticated and almost all-encompassing political program that has been very rigorously thought through. But if there is a weakness there, I think it's the same weakness as with all political programs that have been rigorously thought through without necessarily being in sync with actual political life. And so in reality, you don't necessarily get the responsible nationalism that you want, but you might get the nationalism of Donald Trump, for example. And I think the same applies to trade policy. So we might think about the sort of measures that should be taken either on strategic and national security grounds or on economic grounds, promoting social mobility and helping American workers. But in reality, and I don't want to place Mike in the position of having to defend Trump, but in reality, in the past 4 years, we got Trump's tariffs that did not bring manufacturing jobs back. We got an administration that really sabotaged the World Trade Organization's ability to keep China to account. And I think it might be useful maybe going forward to sort of talk about specific policies and to see where the sort of points of contention are. Because to me, an important part of this conversation is for America to work with its allies, including on trade issues, on intellectual property issues, on investment rules, and so forth. And that's something that's been really underexplored and under-leveraged in this concrete iteration of sort of economic nationalism that we had, which again is not the one Michael would wish for, but it's the one, it is the best one we have currently.
May I respond to that briefly? Yeah, so I'm not defending Donald Trump. I'll give you specific advice on what I think is a more subtle approach. It's local content requirements. Now, most neoclassical economists hate them, but these are the least market unfriendly ways of ensuring that you keep at least a minimum of a certain supply chain or an industry in your country. And if both trading partners agree that they want to keep, let's say, 20%, of let's say chip manufacturing in the US or the EU, and they will be able to step in and bail out their industries if it falls below that. But other countries can compete for the other 80%. That's a fairly market conforming approach to national industrial policy. So the problem with tariffs is it's a very crude one size fits all solution, although I do give Trump credit for at least dramatizing the issue of China. And I think that even a Biden administration is unlikely to go back to the kind of laissez-faire attitude towards China.
So we'll probably move on to audience questions. The first one, and we'll probably start with you, Dr. Rohac, is the following. What do you make of the claim that growth is necessary to a prosperous society, but it is not sufficient? Why do we hear so much growth rhetoric today and not more of a focus on making our communities and families stable?
Well, that's a question that sort of might go beyond my remit as a social scientist. But I would say that economic growth has been associated over time across countries with a range of good and desirable outcomes. And whenever you don't have growth, whenever you have a zero-sum economic environment, all sorts of social troubles arise. And once you're sort of living in an economy that's not growing, the competition over resources gets more intense and can sort of move in fairly undesirable and violent directions. So that's my sort of general take on growth. And if anything, I think we are seeing not enough pro-growth rhetoric. I would like to see, the US economy has arguably slowed down, productivity growth in the US has slowed down, and across the industrialized West since the 1970s, I would like to think about ways how it can be brought up. And I think it would go a long way towards addressing some of the sort of social tensions, intergenerational solidarity, and other issues that have arisen and that will continue to affect our political debates going forward. So including questions of climate change. I think to me, this sort of notion that we can fix the climate problem by sort of degrowing or stopping to grow is, not only a losing political proposition, but is sort of delusional on a whole range of levels. So that would be my short answer, thinking on my feet.
I can take a stab at that. Since I've spoken of good trade and bad trade, I'll also speak of good growth and bad growth. We measure GDP growth, which is, it's really a compound of two factors. It's the growth of hours worked, usually the growth of the labor force, and also productivity, that is productivity per worker. So one way to grow GDP is just to make people work longer hours and retire later. And, you could get rid of child labor laws, you can bring in, 10 times as many immigrants. It's going to boost your GDP. The factor that counts in long-term prosperity is not GDP, it is labor productivity per hour. And that is largely a result of technological innovation based on R&D. So I agree, we should really be maniacal about growth, but it has to be long-term science-based, technological innovation-based growth, not just new ways to monetize cat videos and things like that, which do add nothing to the long-term prosperity of the economy.
Another audience member asks, since most developing countries today, and it seems especially true in Africa, seem to be more interested in economic growth, which resembles, or rather political economy, which more closely resembles that of Chinese state capitalism, as opposed to a growth strategy more oriented towards the free market and the international order. What kind of explains this trend, especially amongst developing countries?
Well, if you look at the post-1945 period, there have actually been three models of growth and development. The dominant one after 1945 was import substitution industrialization, ISI, and that was basically the same path that the United States followed from the 19th century up until 1945. It's what Germany followed, it's what Britain followed it in the 18th century before the 1840s. Every modern industrial economy went through a protectionist phase in which it had tariffs or some other means to protect its infant industries. And then once they developed, if they were smart, sometimes the protectionism lasted too long, as in the US, but at that point, they got rid of the training wheels and they joined the competitive marketplace. Because of the turn towards neoliberalism, towards libertarian and free market thought in the 1970s and 80s, there was a shift towards true free market development, of which, to my knowledge, as a sometime economic historian, there is no example in all of human history of a country which went from a purely agrarian society to having mechanized industries without the government doing anything at all, just as a result of market forces. The de facto model, as you mentioned, was an export-oriented model, first pursued by Japan and the Little Tigers, South Korea and Taiwan and Singapore, and more recently by China. The problem, and people misunderstand this, the East Asian model, sometimes it's called the mercantilist model, is actually a variant of import substitution. It is a protectionist model. Japan uses non-tariff barriers to protect its internal markets, for example, in automobiles, from US and German imports, and South Korean imports for that matter. South Korea also has been very protectionist. China has actually two markets, not one. China protects its own internal markets with tariffs and various other barriers for its own domestic firms, like their domestic car companies. At the same time, it has these little enclave economies on the coast called export processing zones, where they are required by law to export to the US and Europe and Japan, not to the interior of China. And the reason is to lure US and German and Japanese multinationals to these export processing zones, train the Chinese, who then in the next generation can replace the German and Japanese and Americans in one industry after another. So as I say, to my knowledge, you get very small countries like Singapore or Hong Kong, which claim to be laissez-faire, although if you look more closely, they're not that libertarian. But obviously, they live or die based on being part of a larger economy. So as a general rule, small countries have a greater commitment to international openness than giant monster states like the US and India and China, which can be fairly self-sufficient, even if they have very little trade. But I think, so the problem with Africa is there isn't room for another China. China is flooding global markets in one area after another. And there simply isn't room for an export sufficient to employ 500 million to 1 billion Africans who will be entering the job market in the next century. They're going to have to find some other model than simply exporting to the rest of the world. That can be part of it, but it needs to be more complicated than simply having another Japan or another China.
So I would just add that, in my opinion, the sort of role of tariffs and protectionism more generally in promoting industrialization, I don't think it's as clear cut as maybe Michael made it sound. In the American case, if I remember my economic history from Oxford correctly, I mean, the single biggest factor was that you really had this massive economy that and sort of massive continent where trade and outside trade played a relatively little role, and I don't think that was sort of tied that much to trade policy specifically.
I hate to interrupt, but the American colonies imported every single manufactured good from Great Britain, despite their distance. So when usually libertarian economists argue that the tariffs were not a factor, they say, well, they can't, and they say, well, distance and internal market. Well, they can't explain why that wasn't true of the American colonies before we broke from Britain. It was a political strategy.
Well, yes, but the sort of what we are trying to explain is the 19th century industrialization at the time when I think the sort of factor prices within the US, I think, do most of the heavy lifting without really sort of trade policy entering into the game. Similarly, in the British case, so yes, the Brits had protection, the Corn Laws and Navigation Acts and this, that, and the other thing before 1840s. But when you look at the structure of British growth during the Industrial Revolution, this was a growth that was driven by rising productivity in a fairly small number of sectors, which were not necessarily the ones that were being protected. So there's a famous paper by Nick Harley, who was actually one of my teachers at Oxford, and Nick Crafts, that tried to sort of compute the effects of tariffs on economic growth during late 18th century, early 19th century. They find out that tariffs actually had adverse effect on growth. That if you had a less protected economy, the UK would have, Britain would have grown faster. You also can see, looking at the structure of the British economy, that trade mattered much more after the economy was sort of liberalized. So if tariffs had been a big factor in the early phases of the Industrial Revolution, you probably wouldn't, that pattern wouldn't really fit. But going back to the Africa question, we've seen, in spite of everything, fairly impressive growth rates across sub-Saharan Africa. I think this is one of the sort of unspoken success stories to some extent of the past 20 years. I mean, I don't know how to help Africa avoid the middle income trap if it reaches middle incomes. I think it's a sort of serious question, but I think it raises another issue that's sort of important for America from a sort of geostrategic perspective. One reason why China has been so successful and has such a massive presence in places like Ethiopia or elsewhere in Southern Africa is because America has really vacated the space. The West has not been as fully engaged as it could have been, I think, in many of these countries, and maybe we'll sort of end up finding out that sort of middle income Africa will be a zone of Chinese influence, and that would not be good news for the Western world.
I agree with that entirely, and much of the competition takes the form of export finance, which free market libertarians hate through things like the Exim Bank. But that is actually what is bankrolling the Chinese infrastructure projects. They're building highways, they're building dams, they're building electric grids, and it is state capitalism, government-backed export finance, and sometimes just pure development finance. And sometimes it's tied to buying Chinese goods, sometimes it's not. But so, I think I agree entirely, but if we're going to be a player in the economic future of Africa, then it can't simply be trying to find some kind of low-wage job that can be offshored to sub-Saharan Africans. We have to be in there, and it has to take public development aid, private development aid, public-private partnerships, whatever it takes. It ought to be a whole of government approach. And it will be a geopolitical as well as a geoeconomic rivalry in the same way that the Soviet Union and the US had a rivalry in Latin America and the Middle East and Africa in the post-colonial period. So I think that one of the aspects of the post-Cold War period that is coming to an end is this idea that we have economics in one room and we have defense in the other room. They were aligned during the Cold War, and let's not forget, we won the Cold War without firing a shot, largely because of trade and technology and financial embargoes on the Soviet Union and its satellites. There was an organization called Comecon, which was essentially a half-century embargo against the USSR, and it greatly upset many American businesses and financial industries that wanted to invest in the USSR, but we stuck with it, and that ultimately prevailed. So I think we're going to have to align our trade policy, our finance policy, our foreign aid policy, and our military policy so that one hand knows what the other one is doing.
Thank you both for the back and forth. I'm afraid we're running out of time, and so I'll have to ask you both for your closing statements, starting with you, Dr. Rohac.
Thank you. So I suppose since we are on the Buckley program, I want to end on a somewhat conservative note, which is that to me, one of the main appeals of conservatism as an intellectual disposition, as I understood it from Oakeshott and Burke, has always been an extreme degree of care and prudence in tinkering with complex systems that work. And for me, the existing structure of US-led alliances, international organizations, and also trade deals that are in place, those are necessarily imperfect. But on the whole, I believe that ecosystem of sort of transnational, international, supranational governance has also been very effective in making the world more prosperous, peaceful, and free. And I was therefore very disturbed when in 2016 many people on the political right have sort of turned against that system from one day to another. So I decided to make an argument in some way, trying to defend that broad ecosystem of institutions and rules in my book, In Defense of Globalism, which I'm sure would make for a wonderful gift for the upcoming holiday season. And that's why, by the way, I make no apologies for making myself a globalist. And on that note, I thank you, and I want to say that this was a really delightful conversation.
Well, in conclusion, let me quote that conservative Edmund Burke, we must reform in order to conserve. So the bad news is that institutions, systems, agencies, rules often become obsolete as a result of technological, social change, military, diplomatic realignments, political party upheavals over time. That's the bad news. The good news is that it means that one generation did not set the institutions and the norms for all time. They have to be constantly rebuilt every generation by that generation. And you can recycle some of the old material, but add some new things. And particularly to the younger people listening to our debate, I want to emphasize the good news. The post-war system was very well constructed for its time, the Cold War. Although I've been critical of it, the post-Cold War system had many benefits, but it's 2020. And things in 2030 and 2040, 2050 will be different. So it is your generation, the generation of younger people, who have an opportunity to help rebuild not only your countries, but the world order. And let us hope you do it better than my generation did.
Thank you both for this wonderful debate. We're thrilled to have you for, I think it was a great discussion. So to the audience, thank you for coming out this afternoon. And please stay tuned for future virtual Buckley program events. So thank you.
Thank you, Barry.
I apologize for the dog bark at the end.
The age of Zoom.
No
I
worries.
muted myself.
Yeah, and I should say the event will be available on YouTube on the Buckley Programs channel to watch afterwards. So I'm going to.
Good work. Bill would have, I knew him quite well in my studies. I went sailing with him many times, helped him on a boat. He would be delighted that there is a Buckley program at Yale and, carrying forth the tradition, because he liked nothing better than a civil debate.
Yep.
Could be sardonic and sarcastic, that was okay. But civil overall.
Well, we didn't do that much sarcasm this time around.
No, Bill might have been disappointed. I went on a skiing trip one time with him and John Kenneth Galbraith, who was his best friend, Mr. Liberal and Mr. Conservative, which tells you something about the how ecumenical their views were. And